welcome everybody. I'm always excited for these chats because I always feel like I learn more than any other time, really. So it's a lot of fun. And as you've probably all seen in the LinkedIn post, we're gonna basically have an open conversation about regeneration, regenerative design, regenerative education, regenerative agri-food systems. So any question in any part of that, feel free to try and keep it ready. We are trying to be conscious of the time because it seems like a lot of time, but there's also quite a lot of interesting questions. So however you can ask the question in the shortest amount of time, please try to do so. Without further ado, I'd first briefly introduce our guest today. We have with us today Dr. Daniel Christian Wahl, one of my favorite academics, and I hope also for all of you, the author of Designing Regenerative Cultures, which I cannot recommend highly enough, and also just all around a very nice person to hang out with. So whenever you have a chance to do that, I would recommend it. And if you haven't listened to it yet, I could also recommend the podcast episode that we did together of the Regenerative Education Podcast, which is nice to listen to on a walk. And talking about education, as most of or all of you know, that's my main interest. So I'm really curious, Daniel, as you've mentioned before in the podcast, actually, that you've been working more on regenerative foods and agriculture and agri-foods for the last few months than maybe the years before. And I'm just curious, like, how did that happen and what are the type of projects that you're working on in that direction?
Well, so many points to start with. Yeah, I'm tempted to talk more about the education because you mentioned it, but basically, I haven't really worked that much with agro-food systems. What I'm seeing is that there are a lot of new initiatives starting around regenerative agriculture, and the danger again is if we put anything into a box and we try to create answers for the food system, even if we try to do our absolute best with the food system, if we don't foreground from the start that the food system is the water system, the water system is the energy system, that all of it is interconnected, all of it relates. And that's why, like, a quick way to make the loop back to education, if we don't teach people the capacity to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, to come out of the silos of the academic disciplines and still value what's there, but hold it more lightly, which is difficult because we're all trained in the academic discipline to kind of climb to the pinnacle of our field and make it the most important thing in the world in order to get funding for it. But really, what's needed now is synthesis of that knowledge. And what I believe is the only way to bring out of this vast complexity that we've created spotlights on through the different disciplines, to bring the insights from that work, which is valuable, but integrated with all the things we haven't been looking at, which is what Maura Bateson calls warm data, the soft interrelational qualitative relationships between the different fields and between people. And the only way to really get a handle on that enormous complexity is when you get specific, when you work with place as your locality, your community, your bioregion, because then you're reducing a little bit of the complexity of so many problems. Where do we start? Global society. And you're saying, how do we heal this place? How do we heal relationships in this community? And because everything is interconnected, you can work locally and bioregionally in the good faith that if you do that and you support people to do the same in their regions everywhere around the globe, then you're actually solving the global problem, not from the problem-solving mindset of abstracting, but you go into the detail of the potential of people and place. And then you work from that potential. And that, for me, that's actually, to some extent, the essence of the switch when we work regeneratively, that we stop going into this ever more abstractive problem-solving mindset and then find solutions in that abstract space. And then we try to implement and scale up those solutions everywhere in good faith. There are lots of people I know who really have given their life to trying to serve doing that kind of work. But if we flip it around and we work from the potential of people in place, then suddenly you actually work with specificity, you work with life, you work with the evolutionary impulse of diversity. And yeah, next question.
Yeah, no, well, obviously I very much agree. I hope everyone can still hear me because, as everyone knows, technology always fails at the moment you least want it. So my computer just crashed, so I very quickly switched to my phone. I think I got most of that, and obviously, I mean, I can very much relate to focusing on the potentiality of place, going into the specifics of acting on a specific problem at a specific context. And like you also rightfully mentioned, that's not really what we are educated to do, and it's usually also not what we educate for. So I'm really curious, from your perspective, what are sort of like the main, well, I know you're a designer as well, so what are like the main design criteria, the main elements that you would consider important to be able to facilitate that type of connecting with a specific place with the intention of healing it?
I mean, if just as a thought experiment, imagine, because I mean, it was interesting. You said, thank you for the compliment. Most interesting, you're my most interesting academics. I haven't been called an academic for a while because I left academia because of the way that it is actually quite a straitjacket. And those who are passionate about the disciplines and about teaching or about research, very often not the ones that make careers within the organizational structures of universities, and then you have to suffer the consequences. So anyway, I just lost the thread. Spark me again. What your question was?
Yeah, so I was wondering, from your perspective, what are the main design elements and qualities to connect? Yeah.
I like the thought experiment that I'm playing with at the moment is like because you hear in academia, you hear in all the funding calls for academia, the need for interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, knowledge transfer into society. And I mean, that was keywords when I was looking for funding in 2006 after doing my PhD on design for human and planetary health in Dundee. And there's still keywords. Now I'm getting an echo for some reason. Oops. Okay, fine. And I believe that one way, if we stay with that theme of how would we take from abstract problems the conversation towards unique potential of people and place, what would happen if all universities were challenged to, as part of their societal remit, to turn the focus beam of each discipline onto the region they inhabit. So the university where you're at would look at what is our bioregion in a non-dogmatic way. So the hydrology department doesn't get to say, bioregions are defined by the watershed. So this is the watershed, and beyond that, nothing counts. But you have a conversation about what is the real bioregion, like where the sociology department says, like we have done studies, people identify with this place on these boundaries and so on. And then we challenge each academic to actually do knowledge transfer. And that's where design comes in, where each discipline has to talk to both the linguists, the storytellers, people who know about linguistic framing, how do we communicate things, but also the people who help message through design. And then that's where the universities then get invited to collaborate with all cultural institutions in their region, schools, theaters, galleries, and we begin to create a process by which, driven by the universities as bioregional learning centers, we transfer more and more knowledge about our place to as many people as possible through as many art forms as possible, through galleries, through dance, through theater, through poetry, through music, through science museums and specific exhibitions about the bioregion. But trying to always cross beyond the boundaries, and always with one simple intention, that people start a dialogue about how do we belong? How do we belong to this place? And how the ultimate for me, more and more when I speak about regenerative cultures, I see that people pick it up as a new meme, as okay, now how do we create these regenerative cultures? And they see it as a concept. And more and more I'm realizing, no, that's the wrong way to think about this. We have to actually think about it and anchor it into our deep history as a species. If we want to re-enter the evolutionary process of how we as part of life can become healers of the ecosystems we participate in, and actually participate appropriately in the evolutionary process, which we have done for the long journey of our species, otherwise we wouldn't be here right now. And then you reframe our entire history as something that basically took a detour 5,000 to 8,000 years ago through agriculture and becoming sedentary, allowing us to create power structures that were power over, that led to the age of empires, that led to the exploiting of human beings and the environment, but through a mistaken narrative that made us more and more believe that we're separate from the natural world and that we own it in some way, that we stake ownership. If you go back the other way, the long part of our species history, which is basically 99% of the time that human beings have been on this planet, they were bioregionally focused custodian species of the ecosystems they inhabited, and most importantly, pretty much all indigenous traditions in their own understanding of self, individually and collectively. They didn't understand the land that they were walking through as their land, but they understood themselves as expressions of that land. And that's a fundamental shift. And I think that if we start that reframing through all disciplines and art forms of how do we come home to place, how do we become expressions of place rather than owners of place, how do we become healers of place, then we can, through that reduction of complexity by focusing on place with a planetary awareness, with a cosmopolitan bioregionalism that doesn't try to create lifeboats and shuts itself off from other places that are maybe less fortunate, but that actually is a exploration in every bioregion, every ecosystem around the planet. How do we redesign the human impact on Earth within the lifetime of the generations alive today? And how do we do more than just redesign it, but actually live it differently? How do we become regenerative in this place? And I think universities and education has a huge, huge job to do in all of this, but in a way that also requires us to let go of what is education in terms of the current structure of when we do education, when we work, and when we retire. And we understand that all of us need to be educated all the time, and that exactly this process of bioregional focusing on learning more and more, there's so much to learn that none of us will ever get to the bottom of it. But in that journey, we connect. And that's the social fabric that we need to weather the probably quite bumpy ride of the next 3 decades, even if we get it right.
Yeah, there's so many threads that I would like to pull on there, but I'll try to refrain myself. So this will be the last question that I ask before we open up the floor. So if you already have any questions in mind, please write them down or prepare them. So just so you know. And I'm actually gonna take a little bit of a segue into what you said at the end there about the bumpy decades that we have had, and it's a topic that's been coming up quite a lot in my own work lately as I've been transitioning a bit towards more eco-psychology. And because a lot of the work and a lot of the sort of the grief and the anxiety and the difficulty that people are already facing, especially young people, and will continue to face in these decades, how do you see the role of educators or education or maybe society in a broader sense to be able to help each other also deal with that sort of with the sort of psychological side that's so often, or the inner side that's so often neglected when we talk about sustainability.
Well, that's inviting a shift of tone. Because we can either see that there's an increase of pathologies and anxiety and fear and trauma, and then we fall into the habit of our current medical system, which is allopathic, meaning which is in conception pathogenic, meaning it looks at pathologies and then it tries to deal with those pathologies. It conceives of health as a state that you fall out of, that you then develop symptoms of disease, and then you heal it. But the salutogenic understanding of health is that health is a dynamic journey into the future where we just have to keep learning. It's a regenerative process of having things happen to you that you just have to assume and transform with, and then you're able to do the next step. And you expect to be disrupted, and it's actually part of health and a health generating approach to health, where you try to improve positive health of yourself, of your community, of your system, the capacity to deal with uncertainty and not knowing and difficult times. And that's actually at the essence what we're trying to do when we work regeneratively, working on the capacity of each individual and each collective and each place to express their maximum potential and their essence, their uniqueness in that wider system, which would then contribute to planetary health. And so in terms of all the people out there who are getting increasingly anxious about what the future might hold, one could talk about all the positive things that might come from forming community and coming home to place, building resilience to climate change, creating food sovereignty, water sovereignty, energy sovereignty in place, in order to at least create enough redundancies and resilience in the system when large supply lines are disrupted by whatever scenario, we can meet the basic needs of people in place, and therefore we can maintain social cohesion, and we can get people to work together to create shared abundance, rather than in the face of some form of collapse then start turning on each other. So all of that is important, but really that's why I said it's a change of tone. I think we need to go deeper and understand that one of the pathologies of our civilization, or our current dominant worldview, is our inability to deal with death. And at the heart of that, why are we so scared of it, is our conception of self and how we actually belong to life. We look at ourselves as these individuals that are cut off from the rest of life, rather than as expressions of a eternal planetary process that is life itself. So when all the wisdom traditions of the world, all the religions talk about eternal life, they're talking about life being eternal, not us as egos going on forever. And if we can educate people, and this is not just through education, this is through coming together as communities, sitting around the campfire and opening up from the heart about our most deepest traumas and fears, and holding that space together. If we can educate us again to live in that paradox understanding of self, where we understand ourselves as an expression of life that goes on as long as life goes on, and we understand ourselves as an individual, then we can probably individually and collectively hold that uncertainty that we now have to hold for God knows how many decades, of whether it is too late, or whether if we all shift and we love life deeply enough, and we love this place deeply enough, and we begin to love ourselves deeply enough again, because that narrative of we're just a cancer on the planet, and if we could just all be gone with, then life would go on, is also disruptive, or not disruptive, dysfunctional, because it's actually not recognizing that because we have a long lineage of being regenerative species on this planet, we can learn how to do that. And in this detour, to make this very clear before we hand over to conversations, is I'm not talking about some sort of going back to a golden past of indigenous species. But I'm saying if we want to co-create a future and use the best of technology and science and the knowledge we've created through the age of separation, the 8,000 years of the age of empires, now as we're moving into the planetary era, and we integrate that with our long species history of deep wisdom that we can find in every part of the planet, and not with exactly how they used to live, but with the basic insights that with every key decision you want to take in life, ask, does it serve myself? Does it serve my community? And does it serve life? And don't shy away from always asking all three questions, because you have to nourish yourself as a healer and server of life. If you don't take care of yourself, you can't take care of your community, and you can't take care of life. But you also have to take care of life and your community in order so that you're taken care of. And this is a basic insight that every single indigenous wisdom carrier around the planet holds in a story or a song or some form of messaging that is ancient. And we need to pick that knowledge up and integrate it in a way with a very nuanced understanding of technology. How does technology truly serve us? And how do we find a balance between the use of technology where we're connected like this wonderfully, but at the same time, we're disconnected from the patch of soil that is closest to wherever you're sitting right now. And we're disconnected from the forest that is closest to wherever you're sitting right now, because we're in this communication. So how do we find a place-sourced, place-based conversation as a community to nuance how to really re-inhabit place and not lose global connections and live the best of both worlds? That's a big challenge. But I think it's the way through the eye of the needle with regard to climate change and ecosystems degeneration. If we all become healers of our ecosystems, we might just make it. And if we don't really make it because the system has been pushed too far, building resilience in our region and creating the capacity to feed ourselves and clean water and manage water cycles locally, and to bring renewable energy to people, at least at a basic level, to allow them to live well, is also valuable. Because then, like in the worst case scenario, the kind of climate emergency, extinction rebellion, deep adaptation scenario, how do we educate for 3 or 4 generations that have to live with the fact that we're in a system that is possibly winding down towards not being able to support life forms like us? That's the rough end of the spectrum. But by facing that, we can gain the maturity to avoid that future.
Yeah, there's a lot in there that I really, really like. Edikare as a form of loving and warmth around the hearth. Also the last part, having to, that you need both the shadow and the light in a way to be able to reach a sense of wisdom that's strong enough, or a sense of love that's strong enough to take action. But I feel like I've been talking for way too long, so I'm very happy to share the floor. Anyone who has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. I am going to prioritize for the first few minutes students first, but after that it's just going to be whoever was first, so don't worry. And Franziska, yeah, please kick us off.
Yeah, so in our project we work with an area that's like full of greenhouse companies, and in our team we were wondering like, how would you approach the people there to bring like this the idea of regeneration and like working with the community closer to those people, because there's like a lot of like competition going on between the companies, so they don't want to share all the knowledge, for example.
It was very difficult to sort of answer questions like that, because I don't know enough about the place. Like, I mean, I actually, one answer that I'm just quoting in a way from Gunther Pauli, who wrote the book on the blue economy and all that. When he gets asked this kind of question, he says, before we go too much into this problem, give me at least another 5 problems in that same region in order to see, or in that same place, in order to see what response can be given that addresses all 5 of them. There's so many layers with why would you run a greenhouse that grows tulips and imports tulips into the world? But of course, if that's the livelihood of those people, it's not a great place to start to saying, question your fundamental purpose of being a business. But if you do one way, if you hook somebody who is in that world, who is maybe the heir of an empire of greenhouses that have been selling tulips to the world for a long time, and knows that that isn't the future that they want to be responsible for, to continue that practice. One way of looking at these companies is to say, it's an exercise from biomimicry. It's called genotypes and phenotypes. That the same genotype can be expressed in different phenotypes. And so you invite people to say, what are you really good at? Growing stuff. What infrastructures do you have? Greenhouses. And you basically look back, peel back at their capacities, and then you let them envision, how would we repurpose these capacities in ways that fit modern society? Like, could you be the first of these greenhouses that use collaboration with farmers in the area that run regenerative farming operations to help you close a nutrient cycle locally and produce food in these greenhouses? And can you do it in such a way that, I mean, I know that there's a lot of technology already in use of using CO2 to feed those greenhouses. So some of those technologies could be used to feed Amsterdam bioregionally. And so it's those kind of conversations that I would try to find 2 or 3 allies to say, I'm not the kind of person who's trying to help you do what you're doing a little bit better, because to do a wrong thing a little bit better still is not necessarily regenerative. So this whole idea of doing good is great. Or net zero impact. We make a mess here, but we do so much good somewhere else that that ultimately we're great people. I'm not saying negatively anything against that, but regenerative is about developing the capacity of people in place, and the uniqueness of place. So even in that setting of a sea of greenhouses, like flying into Rotterdam, I remember how often like there's these, even in that environment, that is potentially a high density food production area for the Netherlands and the Benelux area. And how do we experiment with intensive food growing that is still linked into a nutrient cycle that actually has a regenerative impact, rather than becomes another sort of importing lots of inputs to those greenhouses and to grow food would not be necessarily regenerative. So it's a roundabout way of answering. I don't know if that serves.
Yeah, it was really helpful. Yeah.
Anybody else? Also reflections or any disagreements or anything that might have got triggered, because I'm not pretending that I'm sharing a perspective. I'm not sharing a dogma in any way. Laura, you're muted.
Yeah, just turning on the mic. I was curious, Daniel. Thank you for your answers till now. What are you working on right now? What is keeping you passionate about something you're writing about now?
I'm actually trying to reduce my time online radically at the moment, and really sort of cherry pick conversations like this, because it's nice to have some connection with the discourse out there. But I've just become a custodian of a piece of land here on Mallorca, which for me is a sort of one loop deeper into, like, after 11 years on Mallorca, because Mallorca is an island, and as an island, a great case study for bioregional regeneration, and also because of that nested relationship between Mallorca and the other 4 islands of the Balearics that are all different sizes. And then the interesting connection between ecosystems restoration on land and ecosystems restoration in the sea. That's why I moved here 11 years ago. And I'm still very much learning and sensing the system. I'm not trying to create some... The longer I've been here, the more I realize that what I don't want to create is Daniel's project on Mallorca, which unfortunately the social media has accidentally created. Some people talk about it like that, and it doesn't serve at all, because it needs to be the local project. And so it's all a subtle weaving of relationships and building relationships in island cultures that have been invaded around every corner of the Mediterranean for 5,000 years. They're not necessarily trust by default. Trust is something that you mainly earn by not disappearing after a few years. And so you need to, no matter what you do, you need to be here for 10, 12 years before the locals even consider, oh, you might actually stay. You just bought some land. Although I find in the process of buying that land, something deep has triggered in me, and that's what I'm working on at the moment. But it's really it's an inner listening process of realizing, that I find it incredibly uncomfortable to speak about buying a piece of land and even speak about my land. That's why I said I've taken on the custodianship of a piece of land, because it does sound a bit clumsy, it's a bit longer, but for me, it's a constant reminder every time I speak about this land that I don't own this land, that it's ridiculous to believe that I could own this piece of land. There's a trunk of an olive tree that probably lived for 600 years and fell over 20 years ago on this piece of land. And that's a relationship that I will never have with this place. But I've got a few decades to work on that. And my focus at the moment is this notion of re-inhabitation. How do you come home to place truly in yourself, like your relationship with a particular place by working physically with the land? I'm actually learning a lot about the disconnection layers that we all must have. And I'm just very carefully sensing into that. And maybe at some point there will be a book coming out of that journey that is almost an embodied journey into what it would mean to come home to place. And in the meantime, I'm trying to, do a lot of other things at the same time, because I'm terrible at saying no.
Can you tell us a little bit about some mutualistic relationships that you've been able to connect with there, and things that are bringing more value to this existence and to the system that you are experiencing?
Well, I find that in every place, if you switch your way of seeing and you open up enough of a holistic, wide envelope, not a judgmental envelope, but if you ask the positive question, if there's already the mycelium network in this bioregion of people deeply caring about this place in one way or another, about aspects of this place, about people, about specific species, about saving the badgers, all of them somehow have an aspect of care for place. And if you begin to see all of that network as the glass half full of regenerative cultures already being vibrant, and the next step being that these different facets of regenerative culture, some more socially focused, some more inequality focused or immigrant focused, but always like trying to heal inequality, trying to heal injustice, trying to heal our relationship with place, our way of meeting our needs. all those healers, if they begin to see themselves as part of that regenerative impulse, and it doesn't mean that they have to divert all their good work into now spending hours on Zoom calls to create the meta network of the local bioregion. It's simply the storytellers and the designers and the filmmakers and the artists need to celebrate that local culture. And I mean culture in the sense of the yogurt culture that turns the milk around it into more yogurt. That's regenerative culture turning the degenerative culture into more regenerative kefir or yogurt, to keep some sort of living analogy here. And for me, that's what I'm enjoying the relationship building here bioregionally on Mallorca with all those impulses. They're very diverse. Many of them are like arch Mallorcan projects of people who live here, and others are really visionary projects that foreigners have started here. And like I'm sure that what I'm experiencing here is the same in many other places in terms of pattern, that there is a disconnection of different bubbles that don't really talk to each other in every bioregion. And I feel like one of the key healing needs in order to become more bumpy ride resistance for what's coming, is to at least address in each of these bubbles, these echo chambers, even echo chambers of positive care in a particular field, the more systemic thinking people who can begin to see how what they're doing is related. Like, so just to be specific, here's a wonderful group called Amadipesment who work with handicapped, like the people with different disabilities, and train them up as gardeners, as waiters, and run restaurants, and also on a printing press. And for me, that's regenerative culture. And they already have a little farm where they work with regenerative agriculture, but then weaving that in with the local permaculture group, but also weaving it in with the waste incineration plant, and beginning to create dialogues where they actually support each other rather than see each other as other. That's what I'm trying to find ways to build a cultural dialogue rather than a leader-led movement.
Yeah. So healing the small connections between the different things that people are passionate about there.
Yeah,
the community.
For those people who need to communicate this into the academic sphere, you can actually tell this narrative using complexity theory. Like, obviously something like a region is a complex dynamic system if we define a complex dynamic system as any system with 3 interacting variables. And mathematically, those systems are fundamentally unpredictable and uncontrollable. And that's like, for anybody who needs scientific backing, that's a fact. And then how do we work with systems that we can't predict and control? And one insight from complexity theory is that you actually don't look at the big data and the analysis of the quantifiable. You look at the qualitative relationships and the quality of the information that flows, and you map qualitative actors who are engaged in healing, and you improve their connections and the quality of information that flows between them. You can't predict and control what happens when you do that, but the likelihood that the emergent property of that complex dynamic system will be positive and regenerative is much higher if you work on that level than if you try to dissect the system and manipulate and control it even more.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I also just learned that for external people, they don't have access to the chat. So apologies for that. Please feel free to just use the raise hand function to sort of join the queue, I suppose, or just unmute your mic and ask a question. I'm really sorry about that. I didn't notice.
Mari?
Yeah, thank you. wanted to go back a little bit back to the conversation when you talked about the 3 questions that could help us become healers: how it served myself, how it served my community, and how it served life. And I was wondering, what is your opinion on communities in this dynamic world where all of us are kind of, to a certain extent, individualistics, and then we live in certain neighborhood and we go to do certain job, but we don't really belong in a community. Especially, I believe, the young people. I find myself really disconnected from my neighbors and from the region that I'm living. For example, I have friends and I have a community at work, but I don't have a community at where I'm living, which really kind of creates a bit of a problem for me to ask my question, how it served myself. It's okay. And then I kind of go further to the third question, skipping this so important question, how it served my community, because I'm just not part of a community yet. And maybe this is so related to the dynamic cities and to living in a big city with a lot of people. So I was wondering, what is your opinion there?
Super question, and so important. And I feel the same to some extent. Like it's now that I've taken on the custodianship of this land, I struggle personally with this. Where do I put my energy? The world's asking so much time and wants our attention in so many ways. And it's so easy to make the intention to say, oh, I am this time, because I actually will commit to this piece of land for decades. I'm going to build a really nice relationship with my neighbors. I'm going to reach out to my neighbors. But it's so quickly, with a 4-year-old daughter, lots of work and other creative projects, to find oneself 8 months or a year later saying, oh, I've actually only talked to them over the fence 2 or 3 times. I've tried to actively do this differently this time around, and I'm still not happy with the results. And I personally got to the realization that our modern busyness is such that if we don't somehow create rhythm in order to meet community, we will not have it. And it's something as simple as, I don't know, like for example, my neighbor just invited me to his men's group, and that means now I have an opportunity to go and meet with that group once a month. And I know it will clash with some other things I want to do, but that's the second question, is to say, am I making time for community to actually happen? Am I creating the enabling constraints in my life that like, for example, here with the neighbors, I realized we will never get into the level of community that I envision us having in 5 or 10 years' time if I don't find a Trojan horse that makes us meet each other. And through that regular meeting, we will become a community. And so that what I've dreamt up, and I'm speaking so much about me, not because I'm self-obsessed, but because I feel I can help you more by giving you a personal answer rather than an abstract answer. Yeah? I thought, okay, and I'm still on that journey, and it is a commitment that I find a bit daunting. I want solar panels on my roof, and I want to change the energy system that I use. And I could do that maybe more easily if I just hired one of those companies that are currently offering to even find you subsidies to do that kind of thing. But if I get my neighbors to come together just one Sunday, and I say, you know what, there's lots of companies now giving individual households subsidies to create an energy system, but these companies are really keen to find neighborhoods that say, here are 7 households that are bordering each other and they want to have a microgrid. And part of me is saying, God, I have other things to do than help manage a process of creating a microgrid with my neighbors, because I'm old enough to realize that that's a shed load of work, and it's going to be a shed load of headache, and we're probably going to have disagreements, and all sorts of things will happen that I don't really like happening in my life. But I also know that by making that process happening, I will create community. And what's motivating me more than having green energy is that community. And I don't know, please respond if that was at all helpful as a sort of very metaphoric answer.
Yeah, it made a lot of sense that we need like something that could make us work together in certain sorry, I'm so I'm nervous. We need something that would help us come together and work towards the same goal, so we could kind of bond around something, like bond around the campfire, if you want, and share stories. So you need this key thing that keeps you together and make you work in the same direction, and then you have community forming.
Yeah, I think the magic is a little bit, because it could be so tempting to just create your own little social media group and go into that fake community of, oh, I have lots of friends, they're all virtual and we like each other a lot and like each other's posts a lot, and suddenly, and that's, people are hungry for community, so they go there, and it's actually an addictive process. Yeah. So we go more to those communities, and then we realize, well, I seem to have a lot, and I, again, speaking myself, like, I'm connected to all the kind of regenerative movers and shakers around the planet, and I love talking to them. But is that really my community? If the shift really hits the fan, and suddenly there are a couple of months where those connections might not be so available, who do I turn to here? Do I really know my community? And so for me, it's also, it invites me into this asking, how much energy do I put into global networks? How much energy do I put into regional networks? And how much energy do I put into true, real community, which is somewhat human scale? It's the people you bump into because they're your neighbors and they're literally in your barrio or in your village, depending where you live. And each age group or each culture will have different mechanisms already that are trying to create community in that area. And so finding them or creating your own, like, to some extent, I think the success, although it was maybe just a flip, like it was an impulse that has continued in different ways, and the transition town movement gave some people in a localized area an opportunity to meet regularly. But it's the best thing is to find some kind of, I mean, it can be through sports or through arts or crafts or theater, but create rhythm in your own area. And don't say, oh, I don't have time for Wednesday evening ballet or theater classes. Do it because that's the connection to people who live close enough to go to that place to do that. And that's the beginning of community creation. And it's really important. Like we need, as human beings, like one last answer to this community, very abstract now, is if you Google Fritjof Capra, the guy who wrote Tao Physics and the Systems View of Life, very, very fascinating system scientist. Fritjof Capra and Daniel Wahl, YouTube, you'll find a conversation I had with, he's now in his 80s. He's really an elder who's spent 40 years studying life and how life works on a systems level as a planetary process. And in this conversation, we basically sort of emerged out of the conversation that really one way of understanding life is that life is a regenerative community. Life as a planetary process creates conditions for life to flourish. And it does so at the planetary scale, at the biome scale, at the ecosystem or bioregional scale, all the way down. And so our job is to create conditions where we can flourish individually, collectively, and where life can flourish. And finding your place in how do I re-enter life as a regenerative community, and how do I do my bit that we collectively create conditions conducive to life. That's really at the essence of living regeneratively. Anyway, thanks for the question. It was super, super interesting.
Thank you for the answer.
Ilse.
Yes,
To see you.
thank you. Yes, nice to see you as well. And also thanks to the students for the wonderful questions. I'm learning a lot. So I'm working with a few of these students on the greenhouse project within the minor. And I really like what you said about the phenotype and genotype and the and I had the fundamental repurposing of business, because I really see that that's necessary. Also, like what you mentioned about how being a healer and the community part, and then realizing what you said, that you don't really know the situation and the business. But if I go into that, what I see is that actually this greenhouse, and I think also in general the horticulture or the food people, they have a really close community. In a way, it's really impressive. It is that they support each other, they help each other, they have parties together, and they are really connected to community. But on the other hand, they're struggling in a way with this repurposing. And what I also feel, that they're in a kind of systemic prison, how to say it. They're connected to the banks and to the big suppliers, and in a way even how, on a macro level, this forces them to grow. The only way that they can be an entrepreneur is to put more square meters for production. So in a way, it's a really challenging assignment. I realize that the students are working on. And so do you have any, because I know that if you start thinking about it, I really like the things that you say. Any advice on that, on the big macro things, and also the making use perhaps of this strong community, but also realizing these big boundaries? How to be a healer in that area?
I mean, first of all, I would try to learn as much about the actual place as I could. So I have to, in this particular case, project a little bit because I only know partially the Netherlands, but I'm assuming that a lot of those places lie actually below sea level, and if the dike system would burst, they would actually lose their greenhouses. So even if they don't want to have a climate change conversation, you can talk to them about a risk management conversation that is valuable within the language of business people. Maybe so just briefly in parenthesis, what I've learned is that in order to crack open these silos of relationships, sometimes, or worldviews, it doesn't help to talk to people where you're at. You have to talk to people in the language where they at. And that means that we actually need to find different languages to speak about the same ultimate outcome, depending on who we're talking to and knowing what kind of languages they would get turned off by. So if you come into a community meeting with these greenhouse owners and you try to talk about, we're all indigenous to life and we should all do more ritual, it might not be the best first sentence to get their attention. But so paying attention to that is important. How do you, what do they care about? And then contextualizing, like if they're already talking about circular economy, then you can say, well, the most effective way to create circular economy systems is to close the loops as closely, like as locally as possible. The mistake Ellen MacArthur Foundation did is to create conversations about European circular systems rather than local circular systems. And getting into the ownership, as you, I think what you addressed is critical. That many of them, as long as they're stuck within the capitalist, extractive, neoliberal business model, that since the mid-1990s, a lot of companies that were previously quite regionally small and medium-sized enterprises working somewhat at the regional, national, and maybe continental scale with their products and services were suddenly forced into global expansion or selling to somebody who was globally expanding. And that's an insidious process that is actually destroying local fabric. And if you say they have a closed-lit community, then that conversation is relevant to them. How do we get out of that maelstrom of that energy that forces us to behave in that way? And one way of doing that is to bring in somehow with, and then there are local examples in the Netherlands, I'm sure, to bring in, like for example, the region of Brabant has this regional development board. They're natural allies to talk about bioregional development. I met them at the at the R3O conference in Rotterdam a couple of years ago. But hold on, I'm losing my thread again.
You mentioned the regional cooperation.
Yeah,
maybe to make use
ownership structures. Thank you. Ownership structures. If you can find a few of them, and usually they're most susceptible at the generation transfer process, where the patriarch has to let go and somebody in the family is taking over the greenhouse. Then, because then you bring both the patriarch's need for legacy and the new guy's need for saying, I can do it differently, and maybe being more switched on to the planetary process, being the younger generation. And if you can get them into exploring what would community ownership, both for our workers, like creating community cooperatives rather than the businesses, and then even looking into how would we, again, use our greenhouse and our capacity and the brilliance of the staff that we've worked with for so many years, like really foregrounding each and everyone's potential, not, he was the manager on the old system, so he can't be useful for the new system. Well, he might be a very good manager, and he might be really happy to work for a more meaningful way of employing his skills of being a good manager. And so this shift over towards community ownership, different ownership structures, but also working more directly with the wider community in the region. So like the model of community supported agriculture. If I had a greenhouse like that and I didn't want to sell it, I would probably say, can I create a community supported agriculture system to grow specific foods that the regenerative farmers in the region can't grow because they don't have a greenhouse here, so they don't need to come from South America or Asia, that I can offer to a market that is conscious, that has a bit of money, fruits or vegetables that are specialty for Europe. Yeah? Right now we take it for granted that we can import tons and tons of ginger and turmeric from Asia. But we also like tons and tons of turmeric and ginger. So these are, to my mind, European greenhouse cultivation fruits of the future. Yeah? Linking it to health and the conversation of good health, starting a regeneratively grown, no fossil inputs greenhouse that produces high quality superfoods in Europe that we would otherwise import from other continents. That's a business model. And that you can get either community share ownership to start that pivoting, but you could write a business plan and even go and find money with all that money that wants to invest in regenerative right now to create a flagship and once you have one pivot to demonstrate, then that community and the closeness of that community will do the rest. That's the same thing I've realized here on Mallorca. The only thing you have to do is do something that is good enough that they come in and copy it. And that's success.
Yeah, thank you. It's really inspiring. And for the students, we will talk Wednesday further, because all the examples that Daniel mentioned, I know they're there, you know, there are the entrepreneurs who are doing that, had the superfood and the turmeric and also the example, I know one greenhouse owner who actually made a place, and I saw it on TV. I didn't hear it on our community, but I am going to hire a few square meters to grow my own food in a greenhouse somewhere in the Greenport area. So the ideas are there, and maybe it's our task to see how we can fit it in the community that we are working on, to make those ideas part of that community.
Have a look at, just to give you, I mean, it's always important that regenerative solutions are always born out of the specificity of local place and its people. So in the kind of more conservative world of Cara Sanford and Regenesis groups, pure what is regenerative practice, there's a sort of dislike of best practice examples and case studies because of the danger that we then copy paste an idea. But I'm just saying that, naming that as a possible caveat, but I think it's to oversteer to say case studies can't be informative. And so that as a preamble to Google or Ecosia or whatever search engine you use, it's called Circle Carbon, and then put Mallorca to definitely find it. Circle Carbon Labs. It's a Swedish guy, as an example of what's going on in Mallorca, who used to work in Brazil, and then because he was born here, decided to move back to Mallorca and set up in an old set of greenhouses, that's why I'm talking about it, that were abandoned for quite some time, a business where they accept local forestry waste and woody waste. And he bought 2 Kontiki kilns to turn this woody waste into vegetable carbon, to biochar. And then he's also got a composting operation on site, and he mixes the biochar with the compost in order to activate the biochar with microorganisms, and creates a really high-end, very expensively sold fertilizer product that is basically a mix of compost and biochar that helps the soil to be more able to retain water and increases yields. And he did this in an old greenhouse system, and also grew in the pandemic. He had to reinvent himself. And so they started using that biochar to just grow vegetables for the local community in these greenhouses. And they turned it into a little cafe where and in order to have direct access to market, every Friday morning for just from 9 until, or actually they start early from 7 until 1, to make it easy for people to fit it somewhere in their day. People can buy directly there. And because they're there and they have a little coffee bar and they talk about their products, and because it is a little bit kind of hip and high end the way they're marketing it, each one of those vegetable buying processes actually connects people who have land here on Mallorca to the product of the soil and the biochar, and then they sell larger income generating sacks of biochar to these new customers. And it's slowly bootstrapping itself. It was a slow investment startup, and it's doing really, really well. And sometimes, like, you could take the hard equality lens and say, well, these niche products are only for wealthy people. But sometimes you can use that as the flywheel to get it started. And then you can ask yourself, how can we bring our products to a larger group of people that can't afford those boutique prices? Guido, and there's somebody else after that.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Bas, for organizing, and thank you, Daniel, for your insights so far. I want to sort of tie my question into much of what has been already asked and said before, maybe to specify it a bit more to a city context. So I live in Amsterdam, and I'm really wondering, like, given the state of how things are right now, with, as we have said often, there's not so much social cohesion in a city, and I think, like, governments and politics are still operating in, like, non-regenerative ways to a large extent. Mm-hmm. What are some entry points or leverage points to become a healer of place in these kind of contexts, mm-hmm. with things as they are? Maybe you have something maybe you could speak to that.
Thanks. And again, a super important question, because so many people live in big cities these days, and it's bizarre because you, on the one hand, live in a more high density population area, but it is actually more isolating than living out in the countryside with just 5 neighbors, because you kind of depend on each other a lot more when you just have 5 neighbors. But yeah, that whole, where do we find our entry points? I mean, for those of you who've read my book or any of the 3 excerpts that are on the Medium blog, you'll notice that a lot of my writing ends up somehow summarizing the most important take-home points, not as bullet points or principles or guidelines or any of that, but actually rephrases them. Like when I wrote my book, I literally went and took Janine Benyus's Life's Principles and just asked myself the question, what I can see it in the background there, actually, the biomimicry behind Laura, there's the citrus. Just spotted that. But I took her Life's Principles and asked the simple question, what would Life's Principles sound like rephrased as a question? And then I did the same with John Fullerton's Principles of a Regenerative Economy. Because suddenly, when you turn these ideas or concepts or principles into questions, you have a tool of reaching out to your community. You can find anybody, the staff that you work with, the community, any community entrance point, your local town hall, find an evening where people are coming together and you ask a question, and then suddenly you create a conversation where you invite people into giving an answer to that question. So for me, in my book, almost ad infinitum, I repeat that sentence of living the questions together, which has a dual function. It makes us less opinionated, because if you have a conversation that is focused on, that's the world's FUCKED, let's find a solution, then people will offer different solutions and argue out what the right solution is. But if you create a setting where you say, we all don't really know, and this is bigger than all of us, and we all still need to learn and walk our way into this somewhat uncertain future, and here are a bunch of questions that let's name the solutions that come to mind, but hold the solutions lightly and just learn from each other about solutions, live the questions about this place in different areas. And each one of you probably has a different passion, social, ecologic, economic. Use your entry point, but then always invite that community to also look at the others. And so in Amsterdam, for example, I know that Kate Rayworth has started working with the city of Amsterdam and has offered this, created this process where some people came together to create a donut. So for Amsterdam, and the whole methodology of thriving places that she developed, that you can download from the internet, and the Donut Economics Action Lab, is also that there are probably already people active in Amsterdam working from the base of the donut. And you can use that group to deepen the questions, because a little bit of the issue around the Thriving Places methodology in the Donut Economics Action Lab is that the original work was funded by the C40s network, which is a cities-focused network. So somewhat it mimetically get everybody to look at thriving places as a city. And the one, not critique, but additional ring that I would like to bring to the donut economics perspective with this Thriving Places work is to foreground even more the relationship between the city and its region. So for Amsterdam, what is the bioregion of Amsterdam, and how? And I know it's a heavily populated part of Europe, so you suddenly very quickly are in connections to other cities. So you probably in the Netherlands actually needing to really acknowledge that place is always fractal, and that for some things you very quickly bounce out to the whole large regions of the Netherlands to supply Amsterdam. But the whole conversation of how would we, for a certain part of our material culture, re-regionalize production and consumption, and through that process build closer relationships between city dwellers and people who don't live in the city. I think is a vital question to create a more regenerative city, Amsterdam. Does that make any sense? Is that, you know?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And yeah, thank you. Like starting with questions, I think is that sounds to me like a great entry point. And I feel like what you've said earlier also sort of directs to start as small as you might, or maybe just start like right with the people around you, and then maybe organize something where, yeah, rather than trying to do the big thing.
Exactly. Like again, giving you a personal example, I'm just thinking, okay, well, maybe it's as simple for me what I'm going to start doing here on Mallorca to invite 5 or 6 representatives of the key organizations that in my area here I feel are doing really good work, and have a conversation with them where they each have an opportunity to share to each other what they're doing, and then say, see, for me, we're all in the same boat. And here are 3 questions that I think we all somehow are trying to answer in our different pet focus, like, I don't know, recycling local food or clothes, or ecological gardening, or carpool, or I mean, there's so many different. Once you have diverse enough of a lens of that, regenerative culture actually touches every aspect of life, and then you look for, in every aspect of life, impulses in your place or in your region that are working place specific, place sourced, place healing. And then you make them visible to each other and start a conversation with those people. That's I think is the essence of a process that you don't know where it's going to go. You don't have to stick with it. Like, design it in such a way that you become invisible. That was the wisdom of Rob Hopkins with Transition Towns, was to create leadership that from the start tries to design its own leadership out of the system. Because otherwise, in the best way of trying to serve, leaders subconsciously put themselves in a role where they burn out because they're the linchpin that the entire system depends upon. And we do so with the best intentions and trying to serve. And it normally is a little bit of a lesson that somebody, like, without wanting to be ageist, like, younger leadership is assertive and tries to create that leadership where every connection hangs on you, and wiser leadership, normally coming from the experience of how burnout dangerous that is, creates leadership where it starts from the beginning to become invisible. And I'm just sharing that because that it's another question to live. How could I kick this all off without ending up in a year and a half time in a situation where everybody says, oh, you have to talk to Guido, you have to talk to Guido, you have to talk to Guido. Because believe me, it sounds nice for a bit, but it's not nice to be in that situation.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. There was a question earlier, but I didn't see who it was. So whoever had a question earlier.
Otherwise, this may be a good moment for a short coffee break.
Sounds good.
Let's say 7 minutes.
So 25?
Yeah.
Okay. See you then.
I actually, I do have another question actually that I want to ask or discuss. I'm not sure yet, but one of the things that in sort of the educational sciences has been emerging now is it has a long history, but it's been becoming more prevalent, is transgressive learning. So actively going beyond existing practices and systems in a way, which I think very much aligns with the intention behind regeneration in general. Like, healing could be seen as or part of healing could be a form of transgression. I was just wondering how do you see that? And you're still muted, by the way.
how do I see that? I don't really know much about it. Generally, it's this fascinating thing, isn't it? About, on the one hand, academics actually do hold one really key insight, which happens to also be, I think, in the beginning of the Bible. In the beginning there was the Word, and the power of new concepts as meta design, as inviting new ways of thinking. But then, of course, the flip side of that coin is jargonization of things. But if I understand you right, with transgressive learning, is like truly transformative learning, yes, does need to transgress the boundaries of what is held possible, acceptable, thinkable, the basis of by previous generations, because we need to, in order to evolve, we need to transgress the boundaries of whatever conceptual construct we have enclosed ourselves in. But I think it, just as disruptive innovation just for the sake of disruption, transgressive education just for the sake of transgression, to my mind, wouldn't serve. It's more realigning to the existing pattern of how life structures information flows and evolution and continued learning. And that's where, in many ways, you're, like what I was talking about earlier, this refocusing the specificity lens of each discipline into the complexity of what does that discipline tell us about our bioregion, and through that creating a sort of kaleidoscopic understanding of place. For me, that would be transgressive learning. It would be actually a cultural process that if once initiated, and you create the organizations, the structures, the collaborations that would do that between universities and cultural institutions and schools and kindergartens and outdoor learning places and basically anybody, like businesses offering internships and all that. That's the infrastructure for the lifelong learning ecosystem that we actually need to create as educators. We need to somehow, even institutionally or operationally, in terms of what are the main actors and institutional types in education, transgress those boundaries and create new patterns. And for me, that's this sort of weaving an ecosystem of actors that aren't just the conventional education actors, but include everybody, that sees living in place as the education project that allows us to never leave education, to always be in education. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I really like that because it turns education more into, in a way, more of an ecological perspective. Like something that, like ecological education in the sense of like Barnett or Bista's perspective, that it's more of a life-wide process as long as a lifelong process. And right now there's obviously very strong emphasis on lifelong learning, but it's very much driven from a neoliberal lens in a way where, you know, we want people to keep coming back mostly because we want to keep charging them for additional training, and not so much because we want them to have healthy relationships with a particular place or with a particular community.
Yeah, I mean, it's that dynamic understanding of education of all types, of all disciplines, of like Paulo Freire has this image that education is not the filling of a vessel or something, it is the lighting of a flame, which really speaks to the deeper root of the meaning of the word education, educare, to draw out. And we say that among educators quite regularly, but actually I think that there's a dimension to thinking of education as drawing out that relates to this drawing out of place, drawing out of the uniqueness of place and its people, to continuously create that process by which we draw out of each and every individual its unique gift to life. Like this assumption that if life is a planetary process and biodiversity and diversity is key to that process, then also the diversity of all of us is key to the future of life. Like what we currently focus on as the culture of this dissent and canceling culture and fractioning even further into silos, can we celebrate different diverse perspectives as healthy expressions of life and then create a conversation around how to live in holding that diversity? And I think that's also part of what, like, how do we as educators bring it back to the potential of people and place and the uniqueness that allows us to hold diversity. And Nico had a question earlier. Nico, didn't you have your hand up? No, you muted yourself. You're unmuted, but there's a little crackle.
Your mic. If you could put it in the chat, Nico, we can read the question aloud for you. And then in the meantime, I also, there's, oh wait, does it work now?
No, it's, Nico, if you mute yourself, then it's not the echo.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, while he's typing, in the meantime, there's some colleagues here as well from the University of Amsterdam who are leading, hopefully leading a project about more regenerative forms of education. Mm-hmm. If they want to ask, or if they're in the physical space right now where it's safe to do so, they may be in transit. But otherwise, I do have a question about that, because one of the sort of the elements that we are taking into that work is that this form of regeneration is both an inside out and an outside in. Oh, I can see Mika. Would you like to take over? And Michaela as well. Great.
Hi.
Yeah, please feel free if any one of you wants to take over.
Michaela, go ahead and take over.
Oops.
Otherwise, I'll just finish my question.
I guess we're both giving each other the space to take over, because I guess we both don't feel ready to take over.
If you want, I can just continue, and if you.
Okay, no, I'm happy to share the puzzle in my head while listening to this conversation, which has to do with the meaning of the word regenerative. Because I heard you in your answers consequently connecting it to healing and community. And one of my own understandings of regenerative has always been to go beyond healing and trying to develop something that was not there before. So when I translate this to ecosystem regeneration, I think of an ecosystem that might be different and maybe even healthier than before intervention, and even before the pristine state we encountered it in. And likewise, if I think of regenerative education, for me, the ultimate goal is not to heal, but to create something that wasn't there before. I would be happy to hear your reflection on this puzzle that kept on going on in my head.
Super, Michaela, because you just put your finger onto one of the like I deeply appreciate that. I've learned a lot from just listening to Kara Samford's work, and I'm very closely in a number of collaborations over the years with Pamela Mang and Bill Reed and Joel Glansberg, the people in Regenesis Group, who have a very specific way of working as regenerative practitioners. And they address, the one place where we don't see eye to eye is that we have different conceptions of what health and healing means. And your question is speaking to exactly that issue, which I briefly mentioned earlier. Like when in 2006, I worked on a PhD in design that ended up being called Design for Human and Planetary Health, with a very academic subtitle, A Holistic Integral Approach to Complexity and Sustainability, and it was 750 pages long. And while I was working on that, I thought it was going to be designed for sustainability, because that was the word I was using at the time. Then I realized that sustainability is lacking as a term. It doesn't give us a direction of what we're actually trying to sustain. And I got to what Gregory Bateson or others would have called the pattern that connects, the hidden pattern, Heraclitus, like the qualitative web of life that brings the nested wholeness into a dynamic, evolutionary, regenerative flow. And that, to me, is health. It's not like, if you think of health in the pathogenic conception, which is basically health is an ideal state that you fall out of, then you have symptoms, you have disease, and you treat that problem, that disease, and then you put people back into that state. In the language of Regenesis, that conception of health, working on health and healing, is maintain level work. It's not regenerative level work. It's just bringing the system back into its old state. That's why they also get triggered by the use of the word resilience, because they also understand resilience as a sort of somewhat rigid, protected against bouncing back type thing. But both health and resilience have another dynamic reconception or conception of it, which is much more to do with what when I talked about the conversation with Fritjof Capra earlier, that life is a nested regenerative community that is, and you're absolutely right, is never hawking back to a state of the past. And this is the biggest problem, and I'm really passionate that you brought this up, thank you. This is the biggest problem I encounter here on Mallorca, with a lot of wonderful organizations that are in the space of marine preservation and conservation. And I know worldwide, wonderful people working on reserves, biodiversity work, and all that. But the conception of nature and ecosystems as something that is a sort of perfect state and we just can get back to it, is not understanding that we have triggered processes over the last 5,000, certainly the last 250 years, that will continue to play out over like millennia and hundreds of thousands of years. And so the whole conception of ecosystems preservation or conservation, I recently even sat down and meditated on, can I come up with a metaphor that describes how ludicrous this is? And I came up with I don't know if it helps. The idea is it's trying to freeze a waterfall in mid-rainy season. Life is this rapid waterfall of transformation of that flows, that transforms, and we can't freeze it and then always go back to that baseline state. And so you're absolutely right. But when I speak about systemic healing, I actually speak about capacity building. That's where I meet with the language of the Regenesis group and Kara Samford, that ultimately, like Carol describes it, as there are 4 modern paradigms that are operative at the same time. One of them is the extractive neoliberal capitalism of extract value. Then there's the sort of stakeholder, shareholder capitalism of arrest disorder, like we can do this better if we manipulate and control the system. Then there's the kind of net impact, net positive impact, do good paradigm of we can do better than that, we can become a force for good. But the 4th paradigm is the regenerative paradigm, and that's ultimately build capacity. And so, and that's where I think we're meeting in both, in all those 3 areas, is that the work is ultimately about building the capacity of people in place to manifest their uniqueness and their contribution to the larger whole. It's a reconception of nested wholeness, like rather than in Charles Eisenstein's words, it's the flip from the story of separation to the story of interbeing, to understanding nested wholeness. And that flip also makes us understand that the only way that we can express our unique contribution, our individualism, the stuff that our modern culture tells us is so important, is actually in service to the next greater whole, whether it's our community or our bioregion. And what I call healing, when I say we're healers, is not harking back to any state, but to heal the capacity within the system, life as a generative process, to keep evolving, to keep transforming, to keep living the questions, to keep asking, is what we're doing right now a fit with the contexts that have changed since last time we asked this question? Does that make sense, Michaela? Now you're muted again.
Yes, thanks. And it reminds me now of what for me was one of the most beautiful sentences of your book on regenerative cultures. I can't quote it literally, but it was something that in our planetary evolution, we were now at the moment that the ecosystem Earth became conscious of its own evolution or something like that. So if you now say, placing this story of the individual contribution to the beauty of life, what is the contribution of individual consciousness of this becoming conscious of its own evolution of our ecosystem?
I think I understood the question. Let me see. I think what you're speaking to is, like in regenerative language, what regenerative practitioners would do in a particular place where they're trying to be of positive interventional participation in the system is to create a field among people of working in a particular way that supports this process of listening to the story of place, of the system, understanding itself, and creating a wider narrative where the activating and constraining forces of local problems, like the local developers against the activist group and all of that, dig deeper into the web of meaning to find a common narrative that actually expresses the potential of place. But that's one way of answering how to the kind of attitude of intervention. Like I love this terminology that they say we're all friends in the work, and the work is the transformational work. But the other way of answering, and if I understood the question right, is something that I personally feel is really relevant to me in my life at the moment with regard to regeneration, that it's less if ultimately we're looking at the capacity to journey, the capacity to evolve, ask questions and respond more than the outcomes. Like even the whole framing, like I had a wonderful conversation with one of Joanna Macy's close collaborator, Chris Johnson, who they wrote this wonderful book together, Active Hope. And in it, he shared that Joanna's recent thinking is that even this framing that comes from her of the great transition that she and David Corton brought into the discourse of we're transitioning from the industrial growth society to a life-sustaining, regenerate life society, still keeps us mimetically trapped in this idea that there's a future that one day we will arrive at and then happily live ever after and down tools. And that basic conception of the future, that basic way of then creating blueprints and blue sky visioning process and backcasting and design hothouses and whatever we call the stuff, design sprints and design sandboxes about how to create that perfect world, still keeps us trapped in the solution mindset and the solutioneering. But if we actually let go of ever arriving at a sustainable future or regenerative future or that other side of the river, and we understand that it's the journey. stupid, like to sort of quote an American president. It's not the economy, it's the journey, stupid. We need to build our capacity to understand that that's life's gift, that things keep changing, and we need to build individual and collective capacity to make conditions for life such that all life can flourish, because that's the way we can flourish. And it's the shared abundance rather than the competitive scarcity mindset. And those core narratives expressed in a place through individuals in whatever language and wording they want for that. That's, I think, is what I would call being a systems healer, but not in this kind of, oh yeah, the patient has this problem, I have a solution, send them home.
Can I come in and reflect?
Sure.
And thank you, Daniel, and everyone really here. I've been following it a bit silently, working on my class, which is about to start in an hour, and feeling inspired and getting into the right state of mind and being for my engagements with students. So that's also what I wanted to reflect on, actually, what kind of the reflections, Daniel, that you offered in terms of it's sometimes hardest and it takes most courage to work on our own direct communities, the people that we engage with daily, is actually what I think, for me at least, is motivating a lot of the work that also together with Michaela at the University of Amsterdam, but with Bas and others in multiple higher education institutes in the Netherlands, that we're trying to develop of really transforming our direct learning communities and seeing this potential of universities as these places of agency enhancing nodal interventions, if you wish. It's such a unique place where all these highly intelligent, capable, motivated students choose to come, and then to have the privilege to work with students is something that I feel is very much underestimated, as we've kind of and I recognize what you reflected on, Daniel, in terms of seeing the university as a straitjacket. I think you mentioned, but actually I feel there are cracks in the system, and there are places where we can create these more regenerative communities, and from there kind of change the system from within. At least that's what's keeping me hopeful in the work. Yeah, but I wonder how that kind of resonates with you, and maybe also, whoops, there's someone downstairs enjoying the conversation. So I wonder how, kind of, as you've now kind of taken a little bit of distance from academia, if you also still see that potential, or where you might see some restraining forces that could actually activate us again, kind of embracing restraining forces. And maybe as an outsider, it's sometimes a bit easier to help us inside see restraining forces that we could engage with, so that we can kind of come to more reconciling collective narratives and spaces.
Thank you. Yeah. But first, just one thing, because I think I forgot to tie the bow on the last thing that I said, but you did it for me by stressing the word being. Like, ultimately, that shift, Michaela, is a change of asking, how do I affect change through my being state rather than my doing state? And it's very philosophical, but I think you get what I mean by that. And now to Mike's question, like, yeah, it's strange. When I finished my PhD, the classic thing happened. I got my 6 months postdoctoral fellowship with the kind of clear line of find lots of money and give most of it to us, and find your salary, and you'll be here happily forever after. We'd love you to be part of the system. And I was doing such systems integrative transdisciplinary work that I literally got sent from one funding council to the other. The arts and humanities, I was in a design school, were saying, this is science, go to the Physical Science Research Council. They were saying, you're in an art school, who the hell are you? We don't talk to artists. And then I asked both of them, copying both of them in, and they literally both said the same thing, as I'll talk to the social science and humanities people. I mean, classic anecdote of academia. But this was 2006, and then when the Horizon 2020 came out, all the things that I wanted to do were actually very much in the forefront. But I'm a little bit too early on the theme. But the reason I'm mentioning it is then I sidestepped and worked at Findhorn College at this eco-village in northern Scotland, and worked with all the hopefuls in academia, all the cracks in the system, all the wonderful people that actually are sticking in there, seeing the intervention potential of education in that way, seeing the agency of their unique little bit rippling out through their students over many decades that go beyond their own lifetimes. And there are people who have that passion for education, and they will change the world. They are changing the world. And so I always believe that there's space for that dialogue. Here on Mallorca, I tried to help a professor to create, it's called Smart UIB. UIB is Universidad de Islas Baleares. It's a knowledge transfer transdisciplinary research center around basically bringing sustainable or regenerative solutions into the community of the university, trying them out there, like even technological innovation. And then through that, seeing how they fit into a Mallorcan context, and then actually bringing the sort of knowledge transfer and so on to embed it in the society. That was the basic principle that we embarked on. And unfortunately, the university hasn't seen that some of this work, it was a link into regenerative agriculture and renewables and new transport systems. And we even had European money almost assured, but the university didn't respond. So I've been burned more than once. So that's why I'm still preferring to work with academia rather than in academia. But at the same time, I do applaud anybody who's doing what in Joanna Macy's terms would be the Shambhala warrior work of going into the system and transforming it from within, because it's so necessary, and I see them as my allies. Pass.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, thank you. I'm a little bit conscious of the time, and Nicholas managed to get his question in the chat. So if it's okay for everyone, I'd like to finish with his question, because I think it's applicable to all of us, although I do have to maybe translate it a little bit. Yeah, so his question was about the relationship between deaf life and self, and particularly in the transition towards being and the focus on being. So what the role of accepting deaf or reconceptualizing our relationship with deaf on the road to being, what that sort of the function of deaf and all of that. And I think particularly would like to know, I think that's a bit more personal, but why he wants to know is for the bumpy ride that's to come and the resilience that's required to be able to deal with that ride. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, super. So we don't end on a shallow note then. I mean, one way, just to zoom out first, to think of where we're at, is that at some point in our journey, we made the significant mistake of being blinded by the power of science and technology and the story of separation, giving us this detailed knowledge and information about aspects of life, that we then thought that this modernity and this progress was creating something that was so grand that everything that came before was primitive. And we actually called people that were trying to tell us how to live appropriately as life in place, we called them primitive cultures. And in doing so, we dismissed everything that they were trying to tell us are basic principles that we need to live by, and basic practices that have served them over millennia to keep the lineage of that practice. And for me personally, the way of counsel, sitting in circles around a fire with a talking stick and speaking from the heart and listening from the heart, is a deeply consciousness transforming process that is vital to human existence. We have sat in circles around fires shared from what was deeply meaningful to us as individuals, owning our perspective in every place on the planet for millennia. And we don't have those processes anymore. And we have psychological illness and disease because we don't have those processes anymore. Because if you set in those processes, you will see that they are deeply cathartic. Every time somebody from the heart shares their own pathologies around responding to the mess we're in, it gives you permission to relax and say, oh God, I'm not the only crazy guy who feels like that. There's another person. And it just builds up. And another practice, which is linked to sitting in circle, is the practice of rite of passage rituals, of rite of passage processes that foreground it, that make people stop in the journey of education and becoming young adults and stuff, stop for long enough and be guided by elders to really ask the question, what does it mean to cross that threshold? What does it mean to stop being a child and being a mature member in a community? And we don't have that rite of passage. Some people have a celebration after they get their school degree and get drunk, and we call that a rite of passage. That's not a rite of passage. Nor is traveling around the world and taking ecstasy on Kopangan. But it's close to being a rite of passage because we have youth that are doing extreme sports or drugs or whatever, and I've done it, because they're looking for a rite of passage. And what this situation of, and now I'm coming to the question, of where we are at as human beings right now on planet Earth, is that we are going through a species level rite of passage at the moment. Science and enough indicators are telling us that we can't continue like we are doing right now, and that we're possibly got to a point where we as a species have, or some of us, very few of us, have created the conditions that extinction for our species might be a true possibility. And it's in that, facing that possibility, that we are forced into the same space as a rite of passage. Like when I went into the Inyo Mountains in California to spend 4 days and 4 nights without food, alone in the desert, it was confronting my own mortality and the risk that opened up a space in which I could get insights that I probably wouldn't have gained any other way. And so, coming even deeper to Nico's question, the bizarre thing in this relationship between being a skin-encapsulated ego and having to live the fact that we might live 100 years, or we might live 80 years, or we might die tomorrow, and we need to live with that uncertainty every day. And it's easier to speak about these kind of things when you're in good health than when you're faced with an issue like that. And I want to recognize that. But I can also share that, like, I remember a time when I was at Schumacher College doing my master's in holistic science 20 years ago, where for about 10 days, I was convinced that I had a possibly uncurable disease. And one thing that I noticed under all that pressure that I was, and stress that I was in as a student, just not wanting to be sidetracked from what I was keen to learn there, was a sharpening of the contrast, a coming into the moment, to the point that, and I'm sharing this very personal story because I think it's an analogy. I remember walking around my dorm room and stepping into a drawing pin, like, ouch. And instead of having the normal reaction, just standing there and being deeply grateful for being alive to feel the pain. And it just puts a contrast to be grateful for the actual ability to, as Michela was saying, as the universe becoming conscious of itself, what a gift it is to be that nexus of awareness that is each and every human life, and that we should never feel that there's a moment where it's too late and it's all going wrong, and therefore we should end it before it's over. I encourage you to find that piece where Buckminster Fuller had an experience like that. He almost killed himself. And in the last moments, he heard a voice, and he wrote it down. And it's a beautiful passage that I'll share with you, Bas, later, and you can share it with everybody. But it's literally saying that your life is not your life. You are life expressing through your body, but your life is not your life. It's not your job to take it. It's you have a job to do. And I think that if we can take that attitude and we see that dual paradox of we might all get called sooner or later and nobody knows when, but there's so much to experience and so much to do on the way. And bringing up Joanna Macy quite a lot because somehow she's a lot of my awareness at the moment. I remember that I asked the same question that Nico indirectly asked me, Joanna Macy, 20 years ago. I said, Joanna, isn't it already too late? And she said, even if we are to go out as a species, it matters how we go out. And I think that finding that place of seeing, I'm not there yet. I'm also tearful because I want this story to continue because life is unique. It's such a gift, and it would just be a real shame if one immature species that had not paid attention to rite of passage work and deeply listening to their hearts puts that whole journey of life on this planet Earth in danger. And life will continue. Gaia will continue. The system will bounce back, but we are worth it as human beings to continue. And we need to find that place of why we're worth it. And the place to find it is to deal with our own mortality. And it's bizarre, kind of slightly esoteric, letting go to let come. Let go of the obsession with having to continue as a species brings a new maturity from which we can then actually be our full potential as a species and turn this whole thing around. Because at that level of understanding, we even get out of the conceptual frameworks that currently hold us in a belief that consciousness is something that evolved out of a physical universe, so that matter is primary and consciousness is secondary. And maybe the big transition that is coming into our realization is that consciousness is primary and matter is secondary. And therefore, if we shift our attitude and our state of being, then things can happen that might not be within the narrative of the current perspective on the world. But that's speculation at the end of the conversation. I don't know.
I think it's always good to end conversations with speculation. And also just like to share that, especially the last part for me is very relatable. I have been diagnosed with an incurable disease. I've been on the brink of death, both because of it as well as because of suicidal tendencies in the past. So that sort of transformation that you can experience on that flirting between the edges between there is very powerful. So thank you also for sharing that. Thank you for sharing all of your wisdom. Thank you everyone else for sharing everything that was shared today. And I hope to see you all soon. Please enjoy a warm day and have a nice lunch.
Thank you. Bye-bye.